Part C. Part C. I've probably only got 15 minutes to go, so bear with me, okay? Right, what? Reconciliation. Reconciliation. And you people are probably wondering why I keep on glancing over here. Can you stop me from doing that? Sure. Thanks. Reconciliation. So what is reconciliation? This is a term where Aboriginal people, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and non-Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people can move forward into the future. And they move forward. I know it's almost a political cliche, isn't it, to say move forward. In fact, I heard an interview with a politician the other afternoon on the radio on the way home, and I think he said moving forward about 5 times. But it's something that tries to explain what is happening with this reconciliation thing. So, but it's about a relationship built on mutual recognition and respect. Mutual recognition and respect. Reconciliation is about recognizing the mistakes of the past, naming them. Naming that the fact that we took land away from the Aboriginal people, that we took their children, we stole a generation, or maybe even 2 generations of children from them, and we have to try to get that harmony back somehow. We have to embrace the land rights movement to make sure that we are an active part of that process. Each one of us, every one of us. We can't ignore this any further. Every single person in Australia is charged with this responsibility. Because reconciliation is about all of us. It's not just about the few, it's about all of us. Because what happened was that there was a lot of trauma involved in this stolen generation. A lot of trauma involved in taking land away. We have damaged the Aboriginal people. There is no doubt. We have damaged them. John, would you like to close that, please? Thank you. We have damaged them. So much so that they inhabit our prisons far more than the regular population do. We have reduced their life expectancy. Well, maybe their life expectancy hasn't grown as well as ours, but certainly we have affected that process. So we have created this psychological trauma, and we need to do something about healing that trauma. Reconciliation has been a very long process. 2 years after I was born, that referendum came in 1967 to allow Aboriginal people to vote.
What was that, sorry?
In 1967, the referendum was made in Australia to allow Aboriginal people to vote. They were actually citizens in their own country for the first time when I was 2.
Oh,
most churches in those days were associated with that. Let's have a look at the Catholic Church perspective. John Paul II, when he wrote our college mission, when he spoke our college mission statement in 1986 in Alice Springs, also said this to the Aboriginal people. He said, "There is need for just and proper settlement that lies unachieved in Australia." In 1986, the leader of the Catholic Church came out here and said, "We have not done enough." So how did the churches respond? Well, a few years later, well, actually, almost a decade later, the church takes a while to respond. Almost a decade later, the Catholic Church made a positive movement towards reconciliation. They joined the movement called Towards Reconciliation in Australian Society. This badge.
What year the leader of the church was 1966?
Yeah, that was Pope John Paul II.
What was the movement?
In 1986, in Alice Springs.
What was the movement?
It's called Towards Reconciliation. That was it. Towards Reconciliation. Another Catholic agency that really listened to John Paul II's call was Caritas. Caritas Australia really entered into that ongoing trauma management of the people. They were the ones that put in place trauma, ongoing psychological assessment and help and counselling for the Indigenous people. The Catholic Bishops' Conference Well, they established a commission in order to look at these things, and of course when they do that, that means action occurs. And the National Reconciliation Week saw initiatives brought in on Aboriginal health. So looking at Aboriginal health, why is their life expectancy so low, and what we can do about it. The last Pope in Australia, who was here for World Youth Day a couple of years ago, Pope Benedict in Australia, said we need to continue this ongoing hope for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The job is not finished, he said. It's not finished. Let's look at the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, they held a few enterprises to be able to facilitate the process. They funded an ecumenical council to help rebuild Indigenous communities and to re-establish languages, to re-establish connections. Anglicare Australia and the Anglican Board of Missionaries formed a reconciliation working group to promote healthcare, family support. So in other words, families got support, families got built up for the neglect and abuse that happened in their families. Anglicare stepped in and did that. But also, they actually trained the Aboriginal people to help each other as well. So that's a very important point. Training, empowering people to help themselves. They set up a trust fund, and a big step for them, which was almost economic suicide for the Anglican Church. They returned land that the church owned to the local Aboriginal people. So if the Anglican Church owned land in a particular diocese, then they would give that back to the people, to the Aboriginal people, which was a very big sign of wanting to be involved in this process in a very practical way. The Uniting Church, well, they focused on that healing and past wrongs as well, the mental healing. They also made a pledge for a better future, and of course, the Baptist Church, the Queensland Baptist Church, made a pledge to make sure that they would acknowledge the past wrongs. So they made not an apology, so to speak, but they acknowledging what went wrong in the past. The next one, the NCCA, which is the National Council of Churches in Australia. This group had the most impact because all the Christian churches are members of this group. Right, so the National Council of Churches Australia, they are the one that issued the public statement on the Bringing Them Home report. They were the ones that looked at stolen generations in detail. And there's a lot on their website if you want to check that out further. Week of Prayer. We already talked about a Week of Prayer for Reconciliation. Now that began in 1993. Remember the Pope said to get something done about this when he was out in 86. Well, in 93, there was an interfaith prayer. It means people were welcome from all faiths. And the common goal was reconciliation. And that happened in Sydney. And that week of prayer happens in different places. So one year it would be in St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. Next place it would be the Anglican Church. The next place it would be the Uniting Church. So it meant Jewish people would sometimes be involved in that as well. So you would see that movement of that week of prayer for reconciliation. But also it included the Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs and Islam were included in that too. And today they're even more involved in those outreach to the Indigenous people.
Does that still take part?
Yes, it still happens today. Absolutely, it still happens today. In fact, your first task to do for this particular outcome is to find out when is the National Week of Reconciliation in 2012. When does it start? That's one of your jobs. And also, the big part to come out of the week of prayer is that we need to, as a community, and this is important, we need to, as a community, devote time to prayer. We need to devote time to thinking about this, to reflecting on our nation and the soul of our nation, and our relationship between the Indigenous people and the non-Indigenous people. It's very important. The soul of this country depends upon our prayers, in that we need to make sure that we focus on it. I have already talked about liturgical inclusions, but a couple of other things that have happened. Some of them are a little bit weird, I have to warn you about this, where they tried to sort of put in Aboriginal symbols over the top of Christian symbols. I don't completely agree with this, but you know, using coconut milk instead of wine, using damper instead of bread, you know, using, but I do like the smoking ceremony and the things that we integrate into it, the clap sticks happening, or the fire sticks, the stories told around a campfire, that sort of thing that we try to do on retreats. The red ochre used on Ash Wednesday instead of ashes, that's a nice little touch. If you can embed the ashes into red ochre, that might be a nice symbol of our togetherness with Indigenous people. And of course, prayers and welcome to countries, acknowledgement of countries being done in Indigenous languages. That's a big part. That's the end of our lecture.